What if I told you the first time I trusted my gut was as a freshman in high school in the middle of a Sephora? Welcome to the Trust Your Gut podcast. You know, we live in a world that runs on mostly logic and reason, but I'm here to provide you a roadmap to life using the most ancient and arguably underrated form of wisdom, your gut. This podcast explores all you need to know on how to harness your own intuition through life's highs and inevitable lows. From relationships to parenting, to wealth management and career shifts, I'll walk alongside you to better understand how to lean into your own intuition for guidance and support. My name is Dr. Alaina Puff, school psychologist turned intuitive coach, and I'll be guiding you through this adventure as I share my personal and professional experiences on how I learned to tap into my own intuition and how this changed my life forever.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Trust Your Gut podcast. I'm Dr. Alaina Puff, and I am going to be your host today. I am so excited for today's episode because I have just the absolutely most wonderful guest joining me. Deana is a colleague of mine, and she is here to speak a little bit more about her amazing work she's doing as a therapist. So before we get into it, I want to share a little bit more about Deana. She is a licensed associate counselor who specializes in trauma, anxiety, depression, and sports performance. As a former athlete herself, she found a lot of opportunities to offer mental health tools specifically to athletes transitioning in and out of sports, new levels to help them better understand recovering from injuries and promoting overall wellness. For all other folks, she provides counseling supports to address current and past anxieties and really help them recover from any previous traumas. Her main approach is using a service called EMDR, which we can speak a little bit more about, which is a trauma-informed modality along with DBT and CBT tools as well. She offers in-person and virtual sessions for those who are preferring a telehealth setting or folks here in Arizona. And I am just so excited to have you here joining us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I am excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So, kind of starting at the very beginning with the guide of this podcast being around intuition, I have found in my experience that folks who gravitate towards becoming therapists generally tend to be more on the intuitive side. So, could you share a little bit with us to begin about maybe what brought you to the field of mental health in the first place?
Yeah. The really where it started for me was like in college when I realized that I had to pick a major and I really didn't know what I wanted to pick. I just knew that I wanted to play sports and I knew that playing sports was going to be the avenue that would help with like scholarships and getting into an environment that I was used to and most comfortable around, like being on a team. So I ended up just kind of following my sister's track because she's also a therapist. And I just happened to literally love it. And then as I was like doing the work, I found I just gained more awareness around areas that maybe I needed more support with my mental health as I was competing and being an athlete and like a student at the same time, just like managing a high load of things. I also realized like with injuries, like the impact that that has on your mental health. And I was an athlete that had a
Mhm.
lot of injuries. Unfortunately, I have the worst knees in the world. So I learned how quickly like your physical ailments can impact your mental health. And so that was very eye-opening for me and made me realize like there's no way that I'm the only person who experiences this. And so that's where like my interest really grew and just like gaining passion for this field and this type of work really stemmed there.
Amazing. I really appreciate how you're highlighting kind of that mind-body connection that I think is missed a lot of the times. I think modern mental health tends to over focus on the mind aspect of things, but really when you were speaking even about the injury portion, like not being injured and not being able to do something that alleviates stress or promotes the feel good feelings, has a direct correlation to your mental health and well-being. And so, I think it's when we connected, I didn't know that you played a sport, and I think that's really kind of the focal point of what I want to speak to you on because I too was a college athlete all 4 years of my undergrad, and I think this is such an interesting topic through the guise of intuition. So, could you share a little bit about your sport, how you got into it, and then kind of that work that you just cited around how you really had to lean on that therapeutic support when you were moving through your college career?
Yeah. Well, I think for many athletes, like we usually start, well, we're introduced to the sport typically pretty young, right? Under the age of 10. So I started playing basketball around 6 years old, but I also was doing like other sports. Like I did like gymnastics, I did volleyball, and just like things that I did baton, right? Like the twirling. So I was really exposed to different things, but basketball, I quickly learned that that was my avenue for just like higher education. And it really just becomes a part of your identity, right? Like that's your circle. At least from my
Mm,
experience, like I quickly learned like basketball is a huge part of who I am. That's how people even just like know me, right? They know me through playing a sport. And so when you experience an injury that forces you to you have to like take a time out even if you don't want to, you start to realize just things shift. Your circle shifts, like your friendship, the way that you can show up around like the people that you usually are around every single day, it just changes. And I really had a hard time doing that because like my first injury, ACL injury, was at 16 years old.
wow.
And yeah. And so like that shift like was really, really hard, right? Because that's also like a time where you really value friends and like having peers around you that are doing things that you're doing because there's like the relatability component and just like feeling
Totally.
seen. And I was not prepared for the mental response there, or just like understanding it. And I think, our parents, they do the best job that they can in terms of supporting us. At least like that was my experience. But there was a part there that I think I would have, I could have benefited from in terms of having more guidance of like knowing that these heavier emotions like depression or sadness or feeling like you don't fit in to a certain extent, like I could have used way more guidance around that and just like normalizing it, I think is
Mm.
where I didn't get enough of. And so that's really like how it started for me too.
Well, I even dating back to 16, I think classic adolescence is that you not only want to fit in, you want to belong to something bigger than yourself, right? As far as like a friend group or a team, but then also just feeling isolated because of that and the subsequent consequences of that. And so I can only imagine, that's such a peak time in identity development for children is like where do I fit? How do I belong? Like what group do I belong to in high school? And clearly it sounds like from an early age you really were able to plug in that you were an athlete and you participated on these teams. And so I can only imagine when you experienced that injury, that was really the first time that that paradigm got challenged. How did you overcome it?
Well, I always knew that sports was going to be like that was a part of my journey. So I always knew that. So the way that I handled it was really leaning into like resilience. And with athletes, like you're taught very early on that like you just keep going. You keep going, right? And so I think I really used that to my advantage and the ability to just like continue to push forward. So, and I think there's also a component there that's like if you know like the destination that you're trying to get to or you have an idea of like the goal that you're trying to meet, then how you get there is going to look different, right? Like there's going to be things that pop up that you're just not really prepared for. But I
Hmm.
always knew what my destination was. So I was going to have to figure it out in some capacity. And so that's kind of I just like leaned on whatever that was, and I think it was really just resilience.
That's beautiful. Wow. What a powerful lesson and skill to develop at such a young age. And I can also echo that. Like I very much knew that I was the first generation college student in my family. So I really leaned on athletics as kind of my gateway into higher education. And so for me, I felt like I have to do this. This is inevitable. I like doing this. It's something I enjoy. And that brought forth such a disciplined mindset that for the average teenager, it's difficult to cultivate. So I was wondering if maybe you could speak to some of the qualities, whether you can relate to this personally or what you see professionally with the clients you work with. What are some qualities that really stand out when you're working with like adolescent athletes?
Hmm. I love working with adolescent athletes. I think that they come in with a very interesting mindset and a different relationship with resilience and specifically like using their body to their advantage. I think with athletes, specifically like younger ones, like teens, because I work with like 16 and up, um, they come in with comp- a special skill to compartmentalize, right? Because they are managing peer
Mhm.
relationships, relationships with mom and dad, school, so academics, and then like their dynamic on the team. So compartmentalizing is a way to survive and to continue to move forward in whatever it is. So that's something that I think they really have a lot of practice in and a lot of skill in. But I think another part of that, or like the other end of it, is when we learn to compartmentalize, it's also easy for us to get out of touch or pay less attention to like the emotional experience that we have.
Mhm.
And the emotional experience, like if we're repressing things or like past traumas or past grief, just experiences that left us unable to cope. Once we start to repress that, it can show up in different ailments like anxiety, um, anger, aggression, isolation. And so that is some of the stuff that I do see show up for some of the adolescent athletes that I see.
So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, that helping them not only, get honed in on whatever their sport is and helping them overcome mindset blocks and injuries, etc., but really also helping them to zoom out a little bit and kind of look holistically at what's going on in their lives and be able to feel and process those emotions instead of having to segment them so distinctly. Is that
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, for example, like some athletes will come in and let's say that they are a volleyball player and they are like a star volleyball player, or they just come in and they're a higher performer on their team. And something happens, not at all related to the sport, that is now causing them to think twice, to hesitate. Their self-esteem or their confidence in that on the court is like decreasing. So now maybe like they're not hitting it the ball as hard. Now they're when they're serving, it's like off, right? Like just some part of their
Mhm.
performance is being impacted. And if we only look at that part of their life, like just the sport, like nothing has really changed there, but if
Right?
we open up and like if we widen the lens, let's see what's happening in the home dynamic. What's happening when they are not in the sport? Like who do they go to sit with at lunch? Do they feel supported in terms of just like their emotional and relational skills? Do they feel like they are seen and heard? Or do they feel like the only place that people care about them is when they're performing well?
Right. Oh,
So when I have like an adolescent come in and like their performance is a little bit off or they feel a shift there, I really focus on like let's widen the lens and let's see what's happening in those other areas of life that impact our esteem, our confidence, and just our overall mindset.
yeah. Oh, that is so powerful. I think it makes me think about because I've worked with some adolescent athletes as well in my past and even currently. And one of the factors that I feel like really contributes to when I start to see kids decline athletically in their endeavors, um, there's this dynamic between them and their parents. You mentioned like the pressure to, some kids might feel pressure that, I have to make my parents proud by performing on the basketball court or on the football field or whatever it may be. Um, can you speak a little to your experience of like, because we do have parent listeners that tune in. Can you speak directly to them around like what you see and how parents can support their kids? Because I've really seen it go both ways as far as like, parents are investing all this time, energy, money into these athletic endeavors for their kids. And so because they want their kids to be successful. But a lot of the times where the conflict comes up is that the kids maybe aren't wanting to play anymore. I have kids in high school who are feeling burnt out on their sport because they've been doing it since they were 6.
Mhm.
So like if you could speak to your experience about how you navigate these dual interests between the child and the parent to find a harmonious balance.
Yeah. I think I think the intention behind parents like pushing their child to compete and just be like the best student athlete, I think that the intention behind them is good. I think
Mhm.
that where sometimes parents can lose sight is realizing that this is also a developing human and
Mm.
their pace is going to be different than your expectations. So I see a lot of parents who, again, intent is different than impact. So I see that the intention is like for the best, but the impact it's having in terms of like pressure and like their interpret student athletes interpretation of their parents like really wanting me to do great, it can feel heavy. It can feel like if I don't perform well, then I don't hear the validation, right? And so then they can start to learn like in terms of core beliefs, the better I do, the more loved I am. If I don't perform well, then I'm less valuable. And this isn't a dialogue or this isn't a language that parents are saying, but that doesn't mean that the impact it's having on the child is not landing somewhere in this arena.
Mm.
Because that's where from my experience, like core beliefs start to really play a role here. So if a parent is applying a lot of pressure, like you have to do these things, like you committed to this, you said that you wanted to do this 6 months ago, you don't get to
Mhm.
quit now, you right? Like there's like ownership there around like you committed to this. And so that's a skill that it is important to like follow through on things.
Right.
But I think that there is also a part that's missing, or maybe there's not enough attention being placed on it in terms of what's the emotional experience that the client is having or that the child is having, right? What message are they getting from their parent? Is it that I have to do this in order to be acknowledged and feel loved or feel seen or heard? Or is it that they love me no matter what, whether I decide to play the sport or not?
Mm. Wow, that's powerful because it transcends so beyond just the actual sport.
Well, and what I even see like with athletes who are adults, or maybe they were former athletes and now they're adults, we learn pretty early on where we get praise and what we
Yeah.
do that leads to affirmation or just like attention, right?
Mm.
So how that can show up like in adulthood, let's say like it's a student athlete, they're now 18, they're no longer, or they're after college and they're no longer playing their sport, but now they're in the workspace. They can start to work themselves to the bone because we've learned the higher I perform, the more attention and praise I get. Hello.
Relatable. I feel seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that is so relatable to my experience. So maybe that can be a good transition. Speaking to your personal experience being a college athlete, and I'm particularly curious around that transition out of college, and no longer being as someone who has been doing this since they were a literal child. I don't hear this talked about as often as it is when college athletes go ahead and hang up the hat, so to speak, and go into the workforce and become young adults and the loss around that and the grief that you experience around that. So if you could kind of share just globally, like what your college experience was like and then that transition. I'm so curious.
Yeah, I love that question because I don't think that there is enough attention being placed on the transition because
Yeah.
change is stressful. And
Hmm.
when we're including like a component that's identity, then there's like confusion of like, well, if I'm no longer an athlete, then what am I? What's
Yeah.
my purpose? What do I want to do? And so from my experience, that was me. Like I was not somebody who always knew since she was young that she wanted to be a therapist. Like that wasn't my journey. Like I just was doing, I only saw what was right in front of me. So when I got to the point of like, okay, like now I've graduated college and I'm not with these knees, you're not going to the league. You know what I mean? We're not going overseas. We're staying put. So I had to also explore like, okay, so what is this next version of me? And I think for athletes, like we don't really have enough time to talk about that or explore that because we're like knee deep in the sport, right? Like we're just
Right.
focusing on our performance in the next game, ways our attitude, ways that we can like have a higher conversion or whatever our stats are. So what I see for a lot of athletes who transition out is that's when the mental health issues show up and it hits us like a ton of bricks. High anxiety, high depression, uncertainty about like our purpose in life.
Mm.
And that's going to impact our relationships. So that is a really scary transition. It's a really scary transition because it almost feels like you're starting at ground zero. It's like, okay, well, who am I then? What is this new identity that I need to cultivate? So yeah, that's something that I see a lot, and it's just really hard to do that. It's really hard to do that.
Yeah. I'm even thinking back to my own personal experiences of no longer I did rowing. I started later because you can't really do that when you're younger, but I picked it up in high school and so some of there was a teacher that told me, oh, well, there's a lot of scholarships available for women's rowing. And, doing it D1 all 4 years, obviously not the typical college experience, as I'm sure you can relate to, of like just, having to get up for those early morning practices and everybody's going and doing what college kids are doing in the evening and you can't. And
Mhm.
I think it kept me out of a lot of trouble, thank goodness, but also it really it upped the level of discipline. There was a level of discipline through high school, but then, like going to college, you were really on your own. And especially when you attach scholarship money to it, that was something I remember feeling a lot of pressure of like, I got to keep my grades at least a 3.0 or I lose the scholarship. And so it's this compounding of uh, factors that are
Mhm.
impressed on young people. I mean, the reality is that they're, 18 to 21, 22, like they're still very much in that late adolescence, young adulthood phase. And I think I remember feeling a lot of pressure around that as
Mhm.
I moved through my academic journey in college.
Yeah.
And then to be placed in a position where I so resonate with what you're saying around like that transition wasn't spoken about because you were too busy competing and training. And so after, I don't know about you, but for me, it was such a loss of an identity component that it was kind of set me on this spiral of like, who am I? What do I like to do? How do I work out just to be healthy instead of to compete anymore? Um, that resulted in like weight gain and I developed like an autoimmune condition and I like started having mental health like struggles with anxiety and just like a ton of bricks that kind of hit me. And so I'm wondering if you can plug in and maybe even share your own experience of making that jump out.
Yeah. It was hard. So I think the component of the mindset for me was it was challenging to go from being in the environment where a lot of my value came from being a student athlete to being in an environment that's like that doesn't like matter as much. And so trying to find my footing in like my adulthood and like what does that look like? Like what does my career look like not as an athlete? So for me it was a lot of trial and error in terms of like my relationship with my body, my new workout routine, um
Right.
my new environment in terms of like friends, like reconnecting with friends that I had before since I went to school out of state. So that transition was interesting. I did in terms of like work, like I worked at DCS and I was there for a time. I went to a university for a time while I was getting my education as a counselor. Um, but mindset wise, like it I had to learn to give myself a lot of grace because there was a lot of changes, like mentally and physically, that
Mm.
nobody really just had the conversation with me on what to expect to normalize it so that it didn't feel like I was like on an island by myself going through this.
Mm. Yeah. I definitely can imagine. I know even from my experience, it felt kind of isolating in that regard. Like nobody could quite understand. I mean, the transition out of college is already a steep one just in general, let alone for student athletes who, this is again pushing up against those identity factors we already mentioned. Um, as far as kind of going back to the idea of intuition. So with the idea that intuition is like this sixth sense, you just are able to know that you know that you know.
Mhm.
Um, how have you tapped into that in your athletic journey, if you have, and even with your clients? I can share an example. I'm working with a pitcher. He's in high school, and we were talking about how he is very intuitive. He just has this natural like sixth sense, and that he can sense what kind of ball he needs to throw based on the batter. And there's no like scientific rhyme or reason for that. He just can feel like I need to throw a fastball or a changeup, and when he listens to that, it usually results in a positive outcome. Whereas if he overthinks it and like engages in that overthinking pattern, his pitch is off. So
Yeah.
can you share either personally or professionally your experiences in mentoring kids who maybe are having similar intuitive experiences?
Yeah. I think the overthinking component is really relatable to a lot of people. And I think when we get into a state where we're spending a lot of time up here, like cognitively trying to logically understand things or make sense of situations, then we can lose connection with our gut, our intuition,
Mhm.
or just like trusting that. So when we're overthinking, we're not listening to our body. But when we kind of turn down the analytical brain, which is very normal, like most of us, when we're trying to understand concepts, ideas, we go logical. But I think when we have the awareness to tune that down, and then it allows us to really turn up like, what is our body saying to us? Like, how does our body feel? That's where we can get into that flow state, right? Like we can get into that
Hey.
state. Plug. No. But we really do have the ability to like even like remind ourselves that we can trust our gut and our intuition because it usually leads us in the right direction. So I think overthinking is very, very relatable. It's very normal, and gaining skills around paying more attention to our body is going to pay out or pay off for us.
Can you elaborate on what that means around paying attention to your body? Because I think people in our field, you and I can know what that means, but for somebody who maybe doesn't make that connection, can you give an example of how they can begin to tune into that?
Yeah. So something that I see a lot with just like clients, and just like people in general is like if you have a conversation with somebody and like you ask, okay, well, how did you feel? A usual response is, I think fill in the blank. And so that is just a small example of how we, without intention, we go very analytically and we go very cognitively. Like
Mm.
we spend the time in what is it that I think about this situation? How do I make sense of it? But if we go back to like, what do you feel? Like check in with your body. Do you feel, and like scan your body from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Do you feel any tension anywhere? Do you feel like any sensation like in your chest or in your gut? Are you like fidgeting? Do you feel like tightness anywhere? Because that gives us an idea on what is the emotional experience. Because something that happens, well, this happens for everybody, but again, it's like around awareness and just like practice, is our body gets the experience first. It feels it first. And then our mind catches up to try to make sense of it. But sometimes we bypass the body's information or clues that it's giving us, and we go straight to the brain, and that's when we can overthink. But like that's also where we have like thinking errors, right? Like because we're thinking too much, like anxiety can be playing a role there. So I like to bring it back to
Right.
like what's happening in your body? What are you feeling? Because that is the clue that we want to pay attention to. And then we can allow the brain to catch up and try to make sense of it after.
Right. So how that would translate into a athletic setting is helping, I would imagine helping the athletes understand, like to be able to scan their body when they're actually immersed in the sport to
Mm.
be able to help regulate them and move them through whatever blockage is there. Is that typically the approach that you use?
Yeah, so something that I think is really helpful for athletes specifically, like before they even step on the court or on the field, is visualization. Visualization, right? Because what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to visualize how we want to perform. It's going to allow us to play out different plays in our mind so that we have an idea on how we want to respond to them. So that when we get on the floor, on the court, whatever the setting is, we've already ran through that scenario multiple times in our brain so that when it happens, we don't have to think too much about it. Our body has already made the connection with our brain that we know how to respond. And when we feel prepared, or when there's a level of certainty there, anxiety decreases because we know what to do with
Mhm.
the information or with whatever play we're in. Right. So, like, that's how I like to prepare athletes, like, prior to them competing, is to like rehearse that in their mind because, again, it's like the mind body connection. And then in the sport is really activating their breath and paying a lot of attention to that. And I know sometimes when, mental health professionals are like, just breathe, it's like, okay, well, I am breathing. But there's the science behind it, right? Like, if we really pay attention and like do like a double breath, right? Like, we inhale, we take a deep breath in, we hold it, and when then we take another breath, it's going to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and allow us to just like feel more relaxed, right? And when we're more relaxed, we can think clearly. So when we are paying attention to our body and giving our body space to feel and creating the connection with our mental state, that's when we really are incorporating like our mind body connection.
Mm, beautiful. I love that. That's so powerful. And I can imagine how that would positively and therefore positively impact the performance of the athletes that you're serving.
Yeah, because if we're feeling stressed, not that like, many athletes are going to feel more stress, but the way that we experience like the arousal in the nervous system dictates our performance, right? Because being anxious isn't a bad thing, but it's about like using that anxiety in a way that's going to help us.
Right. Absolutely. Um, that is so cool. I want to kind of follow up on that, because I imagine being able to give this to your clients, it's something that you implement and practice on yourself. So, kind of building on that, how do you implement these skills as you work in in your work as a therapist? How do you kind of apply that in the lens of working with clients?
hmm So the place that I start, and this is also like a practice like with trauma, but the place that I start, and I like share this with my family, my partner, like he knows all about it. Like this is a good place to start with just like understanding that connection. But I start with just educating on the window of tolerance. And our window of tolerance is essentially the window in which we feel like we have the capacity and emotional ability to cope or handle situations. So, like when we're within our window, we usually feel really good, right? Like we have access to more pleasurable emotions of satisfaction,
Right.
safety, content, right? Like we just feel like, okay, we feel regulated. But because we're complex, we can go above our window where the emotions feel much bigger and anxiety is there, irritability is there, frustration is there, or below our window where the emotions just feel heavier, where it's like sadness, depression, lack of interest, lack of motivation. So where I start with clients is giving them the education that we do have like a foundational understanding of how emotions are expressed in our body and how we feel them. And so I just start with like, let's start getting familiar with asking ourselves and being curious about what is it that I'm feeling? Because then it forces us to like pay attention to our internal system, like our body. Because if I ask myself
Right.
that question, like, what is it that I'm feeling right now? I have to like check in, right? So that's also
Mm-hmm.
building the relationship between ourselves and our body, like our brain and our body. And in reality, like the longest relationship that we will ever have is the relationship we have with ourselves. So the more
Right.
practice that we have being curious about that internal experience, the better that connection and that bond will be.
It makes sense. It makes total and complete sense. Do you think that you being a highly intuitive person impacts your ability to support your clients compared to maybe your average therapist?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that part of it because it's also like,
Yeah, I love your
yeah,
response. Yeah, actually it
it's,
does.
it does. It does because I just feel like it's your relationship is the most important thing, especially in a therapeutic setting, but also like in a coaching setting or like from parent to child. Like the way your child or the client feels around me, or if you're a parent, your child feels around you, is where change happens. If there is safety there and acceptance there and normalizing those challenging experiences, if there's a behavior that we need to change for the betterment of them, in order for that client or that child to feel like it's worth exploring that change, it's going to come because like they feel safe around me and they can trust me. And they
Right,
feel like they can trust themselves when they're near me.
right. They're feeling off that energy.
They're feeling that and they're feeling that I trust them too, right? Because
Hmm.
the relationship is huge. And so I think there are components of like having a relationship that you have to be intuitive about, right? Like you have to be able to tell like when your child or the client is like done talking about a certain thing and like
Yeah,
honoring that and letting them know that like you can tell like their eye contact is going everywhere else. They're starting to get
yeah,
fidgety, right? Like they're just like they're at their capacity. So they're outside of their window. Because when we're outside
right,
of our window, logical conversations are way harder to like move the needle with, right?
right. Hmm.
So it's like also having the awareness and like trusting your gut and knowing like they're done or they can continue to talk about this.
Yeah. That's so interesting because I think that's why when I speak with other therapists, we tend to fall on, if you're thinking of a bell curve, we tend to fall on that above average range for intuition because I think, to be a really competent, fluent therapist isn't about knowing every best practice and competency. Obviously, those are important, but I think what's more important is how to navigate the dynamics of a complex relationship, and part of navigating that is the seen and unseen. It's the things that you can visually pick up on, but it's also the feelings and messages that you're getting internally as the therapist around like, what is my client really needing? And unfortunately, I have not come across a book that teaches that. I feel like part of that is just a natural gift. And so,
Mhm.
um, I was just thinking the first time that I met you at a networking event, I felt that from you. I felt that you had this capacity to kind of really be able to see folks for who they really are and be able to respond accordingly. So we're so lucky to have you as part of our community, and really, this specialization and working specifically with athletes is something that I think continues to grow and grow as an area of need and support, because I think people like ourselves who are on the other side of our own college athlete experiences are really like turning around and saying like, it doesn't need to be this difficult for the ones coming up behind us. And so what
Yeah.
amazing work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I know, I'm so glad that we met. I felt the vibe with you too. So it was very mutual.
Oh, I love that.
It was
Well,
very
if you
mutual.
if you could tell us a little bit about like your offerings and what how folks can find you, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, so I am accepting clients right now. I offer virtual sessions or in person. My practice is aligned counseling. That's who I'm with. And it's a small group practice and we have the best team. But we are located in downtown Phoenix. So if you are wanting to connect, you can find me on Psychology Today at Deana Bledsoe or on my Instagram, Deana Bledsoe underscore therapy. And I'd be happy to
Yeah, your
connect.
Instagram is fire, so you definitely want to go
Thanks.
ahead and give her a follow. Um, it's so lovely having you on here and speaking about something that isn't talked about enough. And I think just blending the worlds between athletics and mental health is just such a beautiful convergence of two areas of supporting not only children but adults as well. So I just really appreciate you taking the time to tune in and chat with me today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you again to our listeners for tuning in to another episode of the Trust Your Gut podcast. We'll see you on the next one.